Is the Unruly Tourists an opera? Is it a story where the music drives the narrative and where the music is going to lead the storytelling and the music is going to be the thing that's memorable about this piece? The answer to that is no, because it's music theatre. Music theatre is driven by text and by words and by actors and singers speaking and singing. And if that is the basis for the piece, then it's a music theatre piece, not an opera.
I think that people who have said that it's about much more than old versus new.
Old.
I wasn't going to say that. I was going to say possibly overthinking it. It's just a new comedy opera. Get over it.
3 members of the New Zealand Opera Board have resigned amid talk of dissatisfaction in the company.
Disappointment and anger with the current direction of the general managers.
In a statement, NZ Opera said it had accepted the 3 resignations, saying the board continues its belief and support of New Zealand Opera's strategic direction.
We have lost people who actually know about the art form.
The people who resigned from the board of New Zealand Opera last year were, between them, 3 of the most experienced opera administrators or opera makers in this country.
There was a confluence. 3 board members resigned, ostensibly over matters other than the unruly tourists, but other protagonists picked up and made a connection.
Really, there was a lot of drama around this, and that was surprising. Suddenly New Zealand Opera was in the news all the time, and it was really fascinating for me. But not surprising, because again, there's a lot of drama, a lot of big activity around it.
I heard that the project was controversial within the administration of New Zealand Opera itself. The narrative playing out was that you had traditionalists who thought this was not a good idea, and perhaps even some kind of corruption of the art form, and modernisers who wanted to do something new.
There was a real lack of communication between the chair of the board and the board itself, and they felt that their views were not being heard.
Is it fair to say that these resignations have got something to do with this particular production?
This might have been the straw that broke the back in the end, but there are many things with the artistic direction of the opera company, with the general director, that many people are very, very unhappy about, particularly these 3 board members.
Assumptions before you've even seen a production or heard about a production are just pointless. It's the idea of something, and there's how you get a pile-up.
I can't tell you whether it's a good idea or not, but I did think to myself, is there really enough in this to make a compelling, sweeping operatic stories such as the ones that have lasted 300 or 400 years and often reinterpreted themselves, right, as put in a modern setting. I've seen Carmen done in the Spanish Civil War, for example.
If you think of operas, then what's interesting about them is very often they have rather banal plots. And if you think about them in their historical context, you would realise they deal with things that might be unpleasant or might be challenging in their day and time. It's just that we've heard them for several hundred years, so they've become something else.
When I was studying in New York in 2008 to 10, this new production of Tosca came along, a modern take, and it was very controversial, made the front page of the New York Times, people booed and walked out, which I found so surprising, because why not give a modern take on an old piece? Think about Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, reached an entire audience because of a modern take, and yet in the opera world this was seen as incredibly controversial. In this production of Tosca, there were no new notes. They hadn't messed with the score. This was the same incredible piece that Puccini had written, and yet it had a fresh take, which in the theatre world is just so common and done all the time, and in the opera world was sort of controversial. And it really epitomised to me in that moment that musicals are about new and opera is often about what's come before, which is why I think audiences and even some artists are resistant to change.
I don't see how producing work about some bunch of British tourists dumping their rubbish in the wrong place and swearing at cameras, I don't see how that's interesting or nice for us as New Zealanders. I'm not saying that all art and all opera has to be serious, but if we're going to sink money into these projects like we are, then they have to have some payback for the community. They have to have some derivable good. They have to do some good. There have to be some benefit to society from making this art.
What's wrong with his direction?
Well, let's just talk about the Unruly Tourist then. I have no problem, and I'm sure the people who have just left the board, I was not on the board, by the way, Heather. I'm a professional opera singer. I just travel the world singing opera, so forgive me. But I have no problem with new opera and peculiar stories and stuff. I personally think this story here is not suited for the New Zealand taxpayer to pay for. I think this is more suited for the English Arts Council to pay. This is another Englishman poking fun at his fellow countrymen, this time being Irish travellers, on a peculiar trip on Cathay Pacific to New Zealand. I mean, I think it reeks of racism. I don't particularly want to be involved with that.
I don't get it. It's like the idea of something is horrific. And here's what I think. You don't get funding to put the arts on in this country unless you're about building audiences. Actually, you're mandated to do that. And that doesn't mean that you don't pay attention to existing audiences, but you have to have audiences of the future.
It's not just a local problem. This is a problem globally. More and more opera companies are diversifying. They're realizing they're having to reach across theatrical genres. They're having to reach into different audiences because opera is expensive. And it doesn't mean to be deliberately exclusionary, but it excludes people, and it doesn't have to. But the price to be paid for that, of course, is you do tend to offend some of the long-term opera patrons and aficionados, and that's sad.
We hadn't even written the opera yet at that point, and people were making these giant sweeping judgments about it, like we're just going to be making fun of the tourists.
It's going to be racist.
It's racist.
Against the tourists.
Classist.
Post-colonialism, bullying, basically.
There were a whole host of assumptions made about the Unruly Tourists, this opera, by people who had absolutely no idea what it was before it had even been written. And it felt at times like the project was being cancelled on the basis of the subject matter itself. And I'm someone that believes really strongly that the arts needs to go to those places that are difficult, that are challenging.
Here's the thing about New Zealand opera. There was this open secret in the arts community for years and years that opera in New Zealand had to change. Everyone knew it. The audience was overwhelmingly old and white. The programming was conservative. It didn't speak to our country. This could have been an opera company in any country in the world. And Thomas came in with a mandate for change. He may have caused some divisions, but if you don't change, you don't grow.